Imagine being so obsessed with flight that you crash your own plane just to learn. Then imagine doing it again. Frederick Handley Page didn't just risk his life for aviation, he bet everything on it. And what he discovered would save thousands of lives, but cost him everything in the end. 26th of May, 1910. A small shed on English marshland. A young man climbs into a contraption he built with his own hands. The engine roars, the wheels lift. For a brief, glorious moment, Frederick Handley Page is flying. Then physics reminds him of a brutal truth. Wanting something badly enough doesn't make you ready for it. The crash is spectacular. The aircraft, optimistically named the Bluebird, becomes a pile of splinters and torn fabric. Most men would walk away. Most men would call it a lesson learnt. Frederick Handley Page was not most men. He dragged himself from the wreckage and immediately started sketching his next design. But here's the question nobody asks. What drives a person to destroy everything they've built just to build it again, to understand that we need to go back? Back to 1885, Cheltenham, England. The Handley Page household was not a place for dreamers. Frederick's father made furniture and belonged to the Plymouth Brethren, a religious sect so strict that even celebrating Christmas was considered sinful. Imagination was dangerous, ambition was pride, and questioning authority unthinkable. Young Frederick questioned everything. At 17, he made a choice that would define his entire life. Against his parents' wishes, against every expectation of a good Plymouth Brethren son, he packed his bags and moved to London. The year was 1902. The Wright brothers hadn't even flown yet. But Frederick Handley Page somehow knew with absolute certainty, that humanity's future was in the sky. He enrolled to study electrical engineering. Not because it was safe, not because it promised wealth, but because electricity and mechanics were the keys to powered flight, and powered flight was the only thing that mattered. His parents disowned him. Think about that for a moment. 17 years old, no family support, no safety net, just an obsession with machines that didn't exist yet, and a future that most people thought was pure fantasy. Today's engineers chase venture capital and stock options. Frederick Handley Page chased something most modern innovators have forgotten. A vision bigger than money, bigger than comfort, bigger than himself. By 1906, he had a job at Johnson & Phillips Limited, a respectable electrical engineering firm. He should have been grateful. He should have kept his head down, done his work, collected his pay. But obsession doesn't follow the rules. He started conducting unauthorized experiments. Late at night, when the supervisors were gone, Frederick transformed the company workshop into his personal aviation laboratory. He tested propeller designs. He calculated lift coefficients. He built models and watched them fail, then built them again and again. The company found out. They sacked him immediately. Now here's where the story gets interesting. Because this moment, this catastrophic failure, this humiliation, this disaster that should have ended his career, became the making of Frederick Handley Page. When the establishment shuts the door, true innovators build their own building. In 1909, at just 24 years old, Frederick founded Handley Page Limited. Not in some grand factory, not with investors queuing at the door. He started in a shed, an actual shed, on marshland in Barking, East London. The kind of place where the ground squelched when you walked and the walls leaked when it rained. This was Britain's first aircraft manufacturing company. Let that sink in. Before anyone believed commercial aviation was possible, before governments took it seriously, before the public thought it was anything more than a dangerous hobby for wealthy eccentrics, Frederick Handley Page was building an industry from nothing. But building a company and building aircraft that actually work are two very different challenges. And this is where we return to that marshland in 1910, to the Bluebird, to that brief moment of flight, followed by that spectacular crash. Most documentaries would tell you Frederick learned from his mistakes and eventually succeeded. That's not how innovation works. That's not how obsession works. And that's definitely not how Frederick Handley Page worked. After the Bluebird crashed, he built another plane. It failed too. Then another. Each failure cost money he didn't have. Each setback pushed him closer to bankruptcy. His competitors, Those who hadn't been sacked from their jobs, who had proper funding, who did things the sensible way, they were making progress whilst Frederick kept crashing. So why didn't he give up? Here's what separates the engineers we remember from the ones we forget. It's not intelligence, it's not even talent. It's the refusal to accept that failure means stop. Frederick Handley Page crashed planes the way scientists run experiments. Each wreck was data. Each failure was education. And somewhere in that pile of splinters and torn fabric was the answer to a question that would change warfare forever. What was that question? What did Frederick discover in those crashes that his more successful competitors missed? That's where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because by 1914, whilst other aviation pioneers were still building glorified kites with engines, Frederick Handley Page was designing something the world had never seen. Something massive, something terrifying, something that would make the generals of World War I realise that war would never be fought the same way again. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before Frederick could build the machines that would dominate the skies, before he could prove that his obsession was justified, before he could show the world that the furniture maker's son from Cheltenham knew something they didn't, he had to survive. And survival, in the brutal early days of aviation, was far from guaranteed. The question you should be asking yourself right now is this: what kind of man crashes his own plane, loses everything, gets disowned by his family, sacked from his job, and still believes he's destined to change the world? Was he brilliant? Delusional? Both? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because the answer to that question explains why some engineers are remembered as pioneers, whilst others are forgotten as footnotes. And trust me, Frederick Handley Page's story is about to get much more complicated. December 1914. Whilst Frederick Handley Page was still picking himself up from crashed prototypes and dodging bankruptcy, Captain Murray Suter walked into the Admiralty's Air Department with an impossible request. He didn't want a plane. He wanted a nightmare. His exact words: a bloody paralyzer of an aircraft. Think about that phrase for a moment. Not an effective bomber, not a large aircraft, a bloody paralyzer. Something so terrifying, so overwhelming, that the mere sight of it would freeze the enemy in their tracks. But here's what nobody tells you. Murray Suter didn't know if such a thing could even be built. Powered flight was barely a decade old. Most aircraft were still flimsy contraptions that looked like motorized kites, and Suter wanted something that could fly hundreds of miles, carry tons of bombs, and return safely through the night. He needed a madman. He found Frederick Handley Page. When the two men met, Frederick was running his company from that shed in Barking. He'd crashed multiple prototypes. His bank account was perpetually empty. By every reasonable measure, he was the worst possible choice for Britain's most ambitious aviation project. But Murray Suter wasn't looking for reasonable. He was looking for obsessed. Frederick took the contract. Not because it was profitable. It wasn't. Not because it was safe. It definitely wasn't. But because someone finally understood what Frederick had known all along. The future of warfare wasn't in trenches, it was in the sky. And whoever controlled the sky would control the war. What happened next changed everything. By December 1915, Frederick unveiled the O-100 prototype, the largest aeroplane that had yet been built in the United Kingdom. The aircraft had a wingspan of 100 feet. To put that in perspective, that's wider than a modern tennis court is long. This wasn't an aeroplane. This was a flying building. The military observers who came to see it couldn't believe their eyes. Some thought it was a hoax. Others thought Frederick had lost his mind. How could something that massive possibly fly? It stood 22 feet high, stretched over 62 feet long, and looked more like a cathedral with wings than a weapon of war. But then Frederick started the engines. Twin Rolls-Royce Eagle engines, the finest power plants Britain could produce. The noise was apocalyptic. The vibrations shook the ground. And when that monster lifted off the earth, every skeptic in attendance suddenly understood. Frederick Handley Page hadn't just built a bomber. He'd built the future. The first squadron was formed in August 1916 and based in France. It made its first bombing attack in March 1917. And that's when the Germans learnt what bloody paralyzer really meant. Picture this. You're a German soldier in occupied France. It's night. You hear a sound like distant thunder, except the sky is clear. The sound grows louder, louder. Then you see it. This massive shadow blotting out the stars. Engines, roaring like angry gods. Arab associates of T.E. Lawrence, impressed by the sheer size of the aircraft, reportedly called it the father of all aeroplanes. But the O-100 was just the beginning. Frederick wasn't satisfied. He never was. Whilst other engineers celebrated their success, Frederick was already redesigning, improving, obsessing. He knew the O-100 had weaknesses. The fuel system was inefficient. The engines needed more power. The structure could be stronger. So he built the O-400. The O-400 had a revised fuel system incorporating two 130-gallon fuel tanks and a strengthened airframe that enabled it to carry an increased bomb load. Most importantly, it featured 360 horsepower Rolls-Royce Eagle 8 engine, a massive upgrade. The numbers were staggering: maximum speed 97 miles per hour, service ceiling 8,500 feet, and the internal bomb bay could accommodate 16 112-pound bombs, 8 250-pound bombs, or 3 520-pound bombs. But here's the terrifying part: it could carry a single 1,650-pound bomb, the heaviest used by the British during the First World War. Imagine that, a single bomb weighing nearly 3/4 of a ton, falling from the sky onto an enemy factory. One bomb, one target, obliteration. By early 1918, deliveries began, and over 400 had been delivered to the Royal Air Force before the November 1918 armistice. The aircraft made such an impression that for many years after the war, any large aircraft in Britain was referred to as a Handley Page, even getting a dictionary entry. Think about that. Frederick's name became synonymous with big bomber, the way Hoover became synonymous with vacuum cleaners. That's not just success, that's cultural dominance. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where we see the difference between old engineers and today's Silicon Valley darlings. Because Frederick Handley Page wasn't building these bombers for profit margins or stock valuations. He was building them whilst German Zeppelins were bombing London, whilst friends were dying in trenches, whilst the entire civilization was tearing itself apart. On the night of 14th to 15th September 1918, 40 O-400s attacked targets in the Saar region of Germany. 40 aircraft, flying in formation, deep into enemy territory. This was the world's first coordinated strategic bombing campaign. The independent force, the Allies' first dedicated strategic bombing organisation, was born from Frederick's vision. The raids were conducted by up to 40 O-400s, causing massive damage. One bomb hitting a powder store in Metz caused damage estimated by the Germans at 1 million marks. So here's the question for the comments. Why don't we celebrate these pioneers the way we celebrate modern tech billionaires? Frederick built machines that helped end the bloodiest war in human history. He risked everything: his money, his reputation, his life, not for a buyout or an IPO, but because he believed in something bigger than himself. Today's engineers optimize apps. Frederick optimized survival. Today's engineers disrupt markets. Frederick disrupted warfare itself. Today's engineers chase unicorn valuations. Frederick chased victory. Which one deserves our admiration more? But before you answer that, you need to know what happened next. Because here's what they don't teach you in engineering school. Success doesn't guarantee recognition. Innovation doesn't guarantee reward. And sometimes the people who change everything get forgotten by the very world they saved. Frederick's O-400 helped win World War I. Over 550 were built. His name entered the dictionary. His aircraft dominated the skies. So why did his company eventually die? Why did the man who built giants end up fighting for survival again? And what invention did he create between the wars that saved more lives than all his bombers combined? 11th November 1918. The guns fall silent. The Great War is over. Frederick Handley Page's bombers helped end it. His name is in the dictionary. His company is famous. He should be celebrating. Instead, he's staring at bankruptcy. Here's what nobody tells you about winning wars. The victors don't always survive the peace. The moment the armistice was signed, the British government cancelled thousands of aircraft orders. Overnight, no warning, no compensation, just cancelled. Frederick had tooled entire factories to build bombers. He'd hired hundreds of workers. He'd invested everything in expansion. And suddenly the government that had begged him to build bloody paralyzers didn't need them anymore. Welcome to the interwar years, where heroes become has-beens and innovation becomes a luxury nobody wants to pay for. But Frederick wasn't the type to accept defeat, never had been. Remember the crashes? Remember the failures? The man who dragged himself from the wreckage of the Bluebird wasn't about to let peacetime destroy what war couldn't. So he pivoted. If the military didn't want bombers, perhaps civilians wanted transport. Handley Page Transport Limited was born in 1919. Frederick converted his 0400 bombers into passenger aircraft and started flying routes between London and Paris, then Amsterdam, then Brussels. He wasn't just building aircraft anymore. He was building an industry. This wasn't about profit. This was about proving that aviation had a future beyond warfare. But here's the brutal truth. Converting bombers into airliners didn't solve Frederick's real problem. Because whilst he was fighting to keep his company alive, pilots were dying. Not in combat, not from enemy fire, but from something far more mundane and far more preventable. Stalling. Picture this. A pilot climbs too steeply. The airflow over the wings breaks down. The aircraft loses lift. It drops, spins, crashes. In the early 1920s, this was happening constantly. Stalling and spinning killed more pilots in peacetime than enemy bullets had in war. And nobody knew how to stop it, except Frederick had an idea. In 1917, during the war, Frederick and his aerodynamicist Bothwell had started wind tunnel experiments. They were trying to solve an impossible equation: how to combine the low drag of a long, thin wing with the delayed stall of a short, stubby wing. Their first attempts failed spectacularly. They tried dividing wings into panels with slots running across them. Nothing worked. But Frederick kept experimenting, because that's what he did. Crash. Rebuild. Repeat. Then in 1919, he had a breakthrough. What if the slot ran along the wing's leading edge instead? What if there was a gap, a carefully designed gap, that allowed air to flow through at high angles of attack, keeping the airflow attached to the wing even when it should stall? He filed the patent on the 24th October 1919. The Handley Page slot was born. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because in Germany, a young pilot named Gustav Lachmann had the exact same idea. Independently, at almost the exact same time, Lachmann had crashed badly during World War I after stalling and spinning. He'd spent 6 months in hospital. When he recovered, he became obsessed with solving the problem that nearly killed him. Think about that for a moment. During the war, Frederick was building the bombers that fought Lachmann's side. They were enemies, and now they'd both independently invented the same life-saving device. When Lachmann tried to patent his design, it was initially refused. When he learned about Frederick's patent, he could have sued. He could have fought. Instead, he contacted Frederick, and rather than getting involved in a legal battle, the two men, former enemies, now united by a shared vision, reached an agreement. They pooled their patents. Lachmann became Frederick's consultant, later working at the prestigious Göttingen Aerodynamics Institute, and eventually became the company's director of research. Two men, different nations, different backgrounds, different sides of the bloodiest war in history, united by one simple belief: aircraft should be safe. Can you imagine that happening today? Can you imagine rival tech companies sharing patents because it's the right thing to do? Can you imagine competitors collaborating because saving lives matters more than market share? In 1921, Frederick demonstrated the slot on a modified de Havilland DH.9. The results were extraordinary. The aircraft could land at 43 miles per hour with controllable handling. It achieved lift coefficients higher than any wing known at the time. The demonstration was so impressive that it sparked a wave of research across Europe. In Germany, scientists started an entire stream of boundary layer control studies that ran from 1921 through to 1944. The Handley Page slot didn't just improve aircraft, it revolutionized them. Suddenly, planes could fly slower without stalling. They could take off heavier. They could land safer. The invention that Frederick and Lachmann created together saved thousands of lives and changed aircraft design forever. Walk up to any modern airliner today. Look at the wing. See those leading edge slats that extend during takeoff and landing? That's Frederick's invention. Nearly a century later, still saving lives. But here's the question nobody asks. Whilst Frederick's slot was generating licensing fees that kept his company alive, through the 1920s and 30s, whilst his invention was being adopted worldwide, whilst he was literally saving thousands of lives, why wasn't he celebrated the way we celebrate modern innovators? Frederick Handley Page invented a device that's on virtually every aircraft flying today. He built the bombers that helped end World War I. He pioneered commercial aviation in Britain. And yet, how many people know his name? Compare that to today. App developers become billionaires. Social media founders grace magazine covers. Tech entrepreneurs are treated like visionaries for building platforms that help people share photos. Meanwhile, the man who actually saved thousands of lives, who built machines that defended nations and inventions that protected pilots, remains largely forgotten. Frederick Handley wasn't seeking an exit strategy. He was seeking victory over stalling. He wasn't chasing a buyout. He was chasing safety. He wasn't building to flip his company. He was building to last, but building to last doesn't always work. Because by 1941, as Europe plunged into another world war, Frederick was about to face his greatest challenge yet. His company was drowning in debt. The government owed him money. The banks were circling. And despite everything he'd achieved, everything he'd built, everything he'd invented, it all nearly came crashing down.